Squid Game was inspired by real events. The real-life inspiration ties back to South Korea's Brothers' Home in the 1980s. This facility housed orphans, the unhoused, and other marginalized individuals. Brothers' Home was initially established to clean up the streets of Busan ahead of the 1988 Olympics. However, it quickly spiraled into a nightmare of abuse and neglect. The conditions were so dire that it led to a national scandal, shedding light on the dark underbelly of South Korea's social welfare system at the time. People and children as young as 4, who experienced poverty, were kidnapped by vans and taken to a strange compound. There, they had their heads shaved and were forced to wear matching blue tracksuits. Brothers' Home was funded by the government. More occupants meant more money, leading to thousands being detained illegally. In addition to the horrific conditions and forced labor, most people faced physical, mental, and sexual violence daily. According to a BBC report, Brothers' Home was described as a house of horrors, where thousands were subjected to brutal treatment. The facility operated with little oversight, allowing the abuse to continue unchecked for years. Survivors of Brothers' Home have shared harrowing stories of their experiences, shedding light on the extent of the abuse they endured. Park In-keun, the director of Brothers' Home, played a pivotal role in the atrocities committed there. He wielded immense power and influence, allowing him to operate the facility with little to no oversight. Under his leadership, Brothers' Home became a place of unimaginable suffering. Park In-keun's actions and the systemic failures that allowed them to happen were the source immense wealth he gathered at the expense of others' suffering.
It was a nightmare that I can't forget. Every day, we were subjected to unimaginable cruelty. The fear was constant, and the hope of escape seemed like a distant dream.
We were treated worse than animals. The beatings, the forced labor, the overcrowded, filthy conditions. It was as if we were less than human in their eyes.
The scars, both physical and emotional, are something survivors carry with them to this day. Upon arrival at Brothers' Home, individuals were sorted into platoons, a method that was supposed to organize and manage the large number of detainees. However, this system often led to further dehumanization and control, as people were grouped and treated like prisoners rather than individuals in need of care. Just like in Squid Game, detainees at Brothers' Home were forced to play childhood games. However, unlike the innocent fun these games are meant to be, losing had severe consequences. For example, the childhood Korean game The Bridge. The victims were asked to form a bridge with their bodies and guards would walk over them. Another game was called Hiroshima. Guards would yell Hiroshima, and every victim had to hang upside down from their bunk beds. They were supposed to hold this pose for long periods of time. If victims moved or tried to get up, they would be beaten, but there was no winning in this game. If a victim held the pose, they would often pass out from the blood, rush to their heads, and fall off the bunk and seriously get hurt or even die. Another game was called Kimbap. In this game, victims were wrapped in a blanket and kicked around by the guards around the room and beaten. Not much of a game if you ask me, just plain old torture. In addition to the games, detainees were often forced into stress poses for extended periods, causing immense physical pain and psychological distress. They were also made to fight each other, turning their survival into a brutal contest. Beatings, solitary confinement, and deprivation of food were common. Sexual assault was rampant. The guards didn't discriminate when it came to their victims. Men, women, and children, young and old, were sexually assaulted. Many women were faced the horror of forced abortions, adding another layer of trauma to their already unbearable suffering. The individuals trapped within its walls faced an intricate web of barriers that kept them ensnared in a cycle of desperation and struggle. The facility was designed to break the human spirit, employing tactics that eroded any sense of hope or autonomy. Survivors recount how the constant threat of violence, sexual assaults, and the relentless routine of forced labor created an environment of perpetual fear.
We were always watched, always controlled. Even if you thought about escaping, you knew the consequences. They made sure we felt powerless, like there was no way out. It was a prison of the mind as much as the body.
The physical barriers were equally formidable. High walls, locked doors, and guards ensured that any attempt to flee would be met with severe punishment. They even made sure to place glass shards on top of the high walls in unlikely case of a victim making it up the wall. Forced labor was another grim aspect of life in this inhumane institution. Every day, the captives were subjected to grueling tasks that left them physically and mentally drained. This included building more buildings for incoming victims as well as providing free labor for companies and factories making children's toys, stationery, baby shoes, and toothpicks. If the victims didn't meet production quota, they would face torture. Brothers Home was receiving money from the government per person per day. Despite receiving millions of dollars, they found unspeakable ways to make more money. This included human trafficking, putting kidnapped children for international adoption, selling organs and selling dead bodies for medical research. They even sold the clothing that was donated to Brothers Home by well-meaning philanthropists. Needless to say, all the above was done illegally and at the expense of the victims whose only crime was poverty. Many of the victims had families outside who were unaware of their whereabouts. Some were kidnapped off the streets, while others were arrested under dubious circumstances. Families were left in the dark, desperately searching for their loved ones, often with little to no help from authorities. Here is why. The dark web of corruption extended far beyond the walls of Brothers Home. Shockingly, local authorities were not just turning a blind eye, but were actively involved in feeding the system. Police officers were instructed to arrest individuals under dubious circumstances and send them directly to Brothers Home. This was not just a matter of neglect. It was a calculated strategy fueled by incentives and kickbacks. Imagine being taken from your home or off the streets with no formal charges, only to be thrust into a nightmarish existence. Many of these victims were never even given a chance to contact their families. The authorities, those meant to protect and serve, were complicit in this grotesque scheme. The police, far from being allies, became jailers, driven by greed and corruption. This betrayal by those in power left families in despair, searching for their loved ones who had vanished without a trace. The victims, already marginalized by poverty, were further victimized by those sworn to protect them. A survivor who was just a teenager when he was forcibly taken to Brothers Home.
I was picked up from the streets without any explanation. They treated us like criminals, but we had done nothing wrong. The conditions were beyond inhumane. We were packed into small rooms, forced to work long hours, and beaten for the slightest disobedience. It felt like a never-ending nightmare. It was only after the media exposed what was happening that the government finally stepped in. But for many of us, the damage was already done. We lost our childhoods, our dignity, and for some, even our lives.
According to various reports and investigations, the Protestant Church had a significant role in the operations of Brothers Home. The church provided support and resources which were crucial in maintaining the facility. The church's support ranged from financial aid to providing personnel who worked within Brothers Home. This association has left many questioning the true intentions behind the church's involvement. Victims and their families have spoken out, sharing harrowing stories of abuse and neglect, all under the watchful eye of the church. The abuses at Brothers Home were eventually uncovered by the government through a series of investigations and whistleblower reports. The South Korean government launched a thorough investigation into the facility, leading to the exposure of the horrific conditions and human rights violations. As a result, Brothers Home was shut down, and several officials were prosecuted. The survivors received some form of compensation, and the case brought significant attention to the need for better oversight and protection of vulnerable populations in South Korea. There is no punishment that Park In-kun and other perpetuators could face that would pay for all the lives they ruined. The worst part is, Park In-kun was eventually sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, not for the human rights abuses at Brothers Home, but for embezzlement and corruption. Him and his family moved to Australia shortly after and are still benefiting from the blood and tears of the victims of the Brothers Home.